cabine à bord du vol Air Canada 90 à destination de Sao Paulo. Les passagers qui souhaitent se porter volontaires pour faire enregistrer leur bagage de cabine jusqu'à la destination finale sont priés de s'adresser dès maintenant à l'agent de vol.
So tomorrow you probably have like 2 hours and then fly to Florianopolis, is that right?
I think like 4.
Boarding zone 2 only? Zone 2.
Hello everyone and welcome to a special episode of Nature's Past. I'm recording this from Florianopolis, Brazil, where I am now currently located because I will be attending the 2019 World Congress for Environmental History. This conference happens every 5 years. This is the third one, and it brings together environmental historians from around the world. Scholars travel from Asia, Europe, North America, South America, and Africa, and Australia to gather together to share new research in the field of environmental history. So I decided to try to record a kind of travel log of my time here to try to capture what I'm going to see in the conference panels and plenaries and keynotes. And I'm going to try and record some conversations with folks attending the conference to get a sense of what it is that they're taking away from it. The other thing I want to do is to try to get a sense of what conferences are all about these days. There's been a bit of discussion, particularly on the Niche website recently, about the future of conferences. These conferences come at an enormous cost, both financially and in terms of the environmental impact of the carbon emissions from flying vast distances to get to places like Florianopolis, Brazil. I've traveled thousands of kilometers from Canada to be here, and I'm curious and interested to hear from other participants about what they think about the kinds of costs that go into these large international academic conferences. So I'm going to try to record as much as I can while I'm here, do a little bit of recapping of what I see and hear at the conference, and share that with you so that for those of you who weren't able to attend this conference, you'll maybe get a snapshot of at least my view of the 2019 World Congress for Environmental History.
Keynote speakers, the presenters, the deans, the provosts, the guests, and the students, without whom we would not be doing this. To all your participants, please do feel welcome to the island of Santa Catarina, Florianopolis. We begin in this moment the opening ceremony of the Third World Congress of Environmental History. The Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina Federal University, is honored by the presence of each one of you here today.
It's a bright, overcast day here on the first day of the World Congress of Environmental History here in Florianopolis, Brazil. I wanted to describe a little bit about the place where the conference is being held. This city is located on the south coast of Brazil in the state of Santa Catarina. It's a smaller city when compared to the mega cities of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. There's probably about 500,000 people who live in this city, which is located on an island just off the coast of Brazil. It's quite dense in the urban part of the island, but there are rural parts of the island as well. It's surrounded by beautiful beaches all along the coast. The sky is pretty overcast this morning with some broad sweeping clouds moving quite quickly. There's possibly a chance of rain, but it's looking pretty good. It's a little bit cooler here because, of course, it's winter this far south in the southern hemisphere. We're looking at low teens overnight and low 20s during the day, and it is quite humid. Vegetation is lush. The topography is quite striking. The city has pretty tall mountains scattered throughout with buildings going up into the hillsides. And it's an exciting and interesting looking place that I'm looking forward to getting to know a little better over the course of the week for this conference.
Virando e virando as margens plácidas de povo herói cobrado retumbante, e o sol da liberdade em raios fulgidos brilhou no céu da pátria nesse instante. Se o penhor nessa igualdade conseguimos conquistar com braços fortes em teu seio, ó liberdade, desafia o nosso peito à própria morte, ó pátria amada, idolatrada, salve, salve, Brasil, um sonho intenso, um raio vívido de amor e de esperança, a terra desce, sem teu formoso céu risonho e límpido, a imagem do cruzeiro resplandece, gigante pela própria natureza, és bela, és forte, impávido poço, e o teu futuro espelha essa grandeza, terra dourada, entre outras mil és tu, Brasil, ó pátria amada, dos filhos deste sol és mãe, gentil, pátria amada, Brasil.
So the first day of the conference was a big success. Everyone seems to have made it safely to Florianopolis. The conference opened up with some welcoming remarks from the organizing committee as well as representatives from the university here, which is the Federal University of Santa Catarina. It was a really amazing beginning to the conference. They had a samba singer there who started the conference with some music, including the national anthem, which I've got a little bit of audio of, which I'll put in, and as well as some sort of classic samba music and some of her own original music. Today was actually the day that I presented at the conference. I was on a panel called Energy and History, Wind, Water, and Oil. There were three presenters on the panel. I presented some of my research on Canadian oil pipeline history, and the other presenters presented work on energy history from different parts of the world. So the first paper was a paper about I think it's Itaipu Dam in Brazil, which is this enormous hydroelectric dam, one of the largest in the world, that drowned what used to be a national park, which is the, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, but I think it's Sete Quedas, which is the Seven Falls. And this is on the border region between Paraguay and Brazil. So it was a really interesting diplomatic environmental history, which reminded me a lot of Dan McFarland's research on Niagara Falls and the St. Lawrence Seaway. The second paper was focused on the Middle East, and it was focused on British imperialism and the transformation of Abadan Island, which is located on the border between Iran and Iraq. And it was the first refinery city or town developed for the emergence of the Middle East as a center for oil production, a global center for oil production. The last session of the day was in the afternoon, and it focused on dictatorships and developmentalism and the environment in 20th century Brazil. There were two papers. One was about the construction of the Trans-Amazon Highway, and the other was about the emergence of environmentalist resistance to environmental destruction under the Brazilian dictatorship from the 1960s to the 1980s. So the two papers worked really well together. The paper on the construction of the Trans-Amazon Highway was really fascinating, and fascinating to look at images of the highway today, which is incomplete. It doesn't run its full originally planned distance, and there are large sections of the highway that remain unpaved, and that's had all sorts of environmental consequences for the Amazon ecology. But it was nice to have these two papers together because it led to a really robust discussion in the room, and it was a great illustration of the value of this conference as a world congress for environmental history. There were people from all over the world in the session who started a debate and discussion about the relationship between authoritarianism and developmental environmental transformations, and whether or not the sort of brute force approach to ecological change that was implemented by the authoritarian government in Brazil was symptomatic of authoritarian governments, or whether it was symptomatic of capitalist economies that could be found in other parts of the world under other systems of government, like in liberal democracies, for example. It was really reminiscent of some of James Scott's work from Seeing Like a State, but there were some great examples that people brought up from India, from Alaska, from Chile, and other parts of the world, and it was great to have people there. There were also examples from China, and there were people from each of these different parts of the world talking about their own histories and comparing them to one another. So I thought it was a great example of the strength of a conference like the World Congress of Environmental History. And that wrapped up the day. We all convened in the main event center at the end for a sponsored reception. We had some food, we had some drinks, and that ended off the first day of the conference. And I'm looking forward to the second. Okay, so we're in a cab just heading into downtown Florianopolis, and I'm joined here by Josh McFadgen from University of Prince Edward Island, and a little-known historian named Alan McEachern from Western University. Sorry, my apologies. Just wondering if you guys saw anything good today at the conference.
Sure, yeah. No, I saw a good panel just now on agricultural knowledge. And there's quite a lot on transatlantic transfer. Actually, I saw two panels, oddly enough. One earlier on Italian immigrants in southern Brazil, at the end of which some guy stands up and said, "Oh, you should come to my panel. It's next, and it's on German immigrants in southern Brazil." And these two colonies, the Santa Cruz German colony, and then the Italian migrants who came later, were both actually really interesting papers looking at, they were kind of like the socioeconomic histories of those, socioecological histories of those communities. Pretty cool.
This is Josh here, Sean. I've been wildly disappointed with the quality of the work so far.
I'm not paying attention.
Mine. It's been a good day. I mean, I gotta say, this is one of those days where I feel like some of the best conferencing has been outside the sessions, to be honest. The breaks and the coffees and everything, and the cab rides. I've been learning a lot, and that part I wasn't actually being facetious.
Yeah, I think I agree. Lots of like in-between session stuff that I've really been enjoying, and I won't spoil what I enjoyed from today because I get to do a full recap myself. On this
Another
podcast.
highlight from agricultural knowledge panel was camel plows in Russia. the Siberian camels. You've heard of them, I'm sure.
Apparently, actually,
Yeah.
Anna, right, from Ukraine.
Yeah.
She's great.
Okay, no, that was her paper. It was quite good.
Oh, wow.
Apparently 1.4 million camels were used for agriculture in Russia around 1916-ish. It's a lot.
Well, there you have it. Raw hot takes on World Congress of Environmental History. Day 2 of the World Congress of Environmental History was another jam-packed day of sessions and mixing and mingling with folks from all over the world. I want to highlight just a couple of points of what I saw today. My first session of the day that I attended was an animal history session that had 3 presenters, 2 of whom were presenting work on human-baboon relationships in southern Africa. Sandra Swart's paper on baboons in South Africa was excellent and kind of fascinating analysis of the long durée of the relationship between people and baboons in southern Africa that highlighted a lot of stuff that I hadn't thought about. But the subsequent papers that dealt with baboons in other parts of southern Africa, and then the third paper, which dealt with changes in wild animal populations in China from the 17th century to the mid-20th century, triggered a conversation about the broader relationship between humans and wild animals over time, and whether or not by the 20th century we were seeing wild animals essentially drawn into the orbit of the human world and either destroyed by it in terms of a kind of incompatibility with human modified environments, or compelled to adapt to human environments and become synanthropes, species adapted to human habitats. It was a really rich conversation and a great discussion on animal history, and showed the continued vibrance of this field, but from a broader global perspective, with scholars from South Africa, Lesotho, and China dealing with very similar questions about human-animal relations over time. Later in the day, there was a great panel of editors from environmental history journals. 4 appeared, one from the Journal for Solcha, which is a Latin American environmental history society. The editor, one of the editors of Environmental History, the journal, one of the editors, or the editor of International Review of Environmental History, and finally there was somebody from the Rachel Carson Center there to talk about the publications of the Rachel Carson Center, including RCC Perspectives. So it was a good, broad, sweeping roundtable about the current state of environmental history journal publishing. There was some conversation around the sustainability of academic journals, both financial sustainability and content sustainability of journals in terms of recruiting authors to contribute manuscripts and how to manage the flow of manuscripts. And there was a little bit of discussion about the potential futures for academic publishing at the article level, and whether or not we would start to see the format of the academic article evolve or change over time in response to digital publishing. I wasn't entirely satisfied with how much time we devoted towards that part of the conversation, because that was something I was especially interested in, but it was great to have those 4 individuals from those different publications all together talking about the kind of state of publishing articles in environmental history. So that was day 2. Looking forward to the 3rd day of the conference, hoping to see more Brazilian environmental history, which I know is on the agenda, and who knows what else will come up here at the World Congress of Environmental History.
Coração, isso é cansado de sofrer desilusão.
So day 3 of the World Congress is wrapped up. I just want to do a quick recap of one of the sessions that I saw today. The session was called Landscape and Environmental Change in China and Beyond, Historical and Cross-Cultural Perspectives. This was an excellent session of papers that looked at different ways in which China in its past has influenced the environments of the Pacific region. In particular, I was interested in James Beattie's paper, Creating the Cantonese Pacific, Resource Frontiers, Environmental Change in Chinese Migration and Trade, 1790s to 1920s. I was mostly interested in this just because of how much seemed familiar to me from what I knew of British Columbia history. So James's paper looked at the influence of Chinese migrants in Australia and New Zealand on environmental change in those two countries. And in particular, he was focused on Chinese miners. Now, a very similar thing occurred in British Columbia as well, and in California, also through mining. And in fact, the last Canadian History and Environment Summer School focused on archaeological sites of Chinese mining in the Fraser River Canyon. So this just stood out to me as one of several examples at the World Congress where you can make connections to other case studies in environmental history to find commonalities or to illuminate phenomenon that go beyond national borders and potentially even reflect global transformations in human-nature relations over time. So that's something that stood out to me on day 3 here in Florianopolis. Okay, so let's just say who we are and where we're from. And we'll start over here, here, and then here.
All right. Sabina Arch at Whitman College in Washington State.
Daniel McFarland, Western Michigan University.
Ariel Helmuth, Rachel Carson Center, Munich.
Wonderful. So you can probably hear the music in the background. We're in a restaurant in Florianopolis after the 4th day of the World Congress of Environmental History, and I managed to secure 3 bright minds here who are going to share some of their thoughts about what they've seen at the conference and what they've enjoyed. So the floor is open.
Go for it, Dan.
Well, after having just seen a wonderful keynote on PFAS, that's been the highlight for me. Of course, highlight's a low bar in that I just arrived yesterday and haven't seen that many papers yet. But it looks like there was a fantastic array of water history, which I'm very interested in. But yeah, the keynote today, I'm forgetting the name, Robert Bellotti. Just gave a fantastic presentation.
It was so good. And also an impressive presentation, too. Like, his style of speaking, completely off notes. Like, he's obviously done this talk before, but it felt so natural and, like, engaging. What did you like?
I liked the fact that there were multiple panels about whales, which is what I study, so that was fun to see so many different people, and dolphins, the Baiji dolphin counts too. But it just, mostly, apart from panels, but it's just fantastic to see people from like all over the world.
Yes, and I haven't seen too many panels that are just one country. Like, many of them are multinational takes on a particular topic in environmental history.
Great.
Highlights.
Okay, so Ariel, what have you enjoyed at the conference so far?
Okay, well, there was 2 things that I really liked. I went to the panels on Brazilian environmental history yesterday.
Oh, yes.
That was really a great look at sort of like the history of the country, as also sort of the modern situation as well. José Augusto Padua had this amazing slide from a presentation he did even just 3 years ago about how the rainforests were no longer being cut down and how they were almost not going to be deforesting anymore. And fast forward 3 years and everything they thought couldn't happen has happened, and that trend has been reversed. So that was one really great moment. Then I also went to my colleague Katie Ritzen's panel today on soil poor to oil rich.
Oh, right. Yeah, I couldn't make it to that one.
Yeah, and they did a great job of bringing in just a lot of different kinds of sources. So we heard about books and poems, art, movies, and they really covered from like the 1850s to present, and sort of looked at all of Scandinavia. It was a really interesting panel. So those are my two highlights so far.
Excellent, and we're joined once again by Alan McEachern here. If he wants to get in on the discussion about what he enjoyed from today's fourth day of the World Congress.
Well, I enjoyed the morning when my good friend Josh McFadden and I took a hike in Lagoa. But then this afternoon I saw a great session on the Great Acceleration.
Oh, yeah.
And that worked very well, I thought. Representatives from North America, Europe, and South America. That was a great session. And then it was a kick-ass, can I say kick-ass?
I'm sorry, this is on the internet. You can't swear.
It was a kick-ass keynote by Mr. Bilott.
Yeah.
First-rate delivery and content.
Yeah, hands down, I think the keynote was like well received across the board, like completely engaging. And for me, seeing something like that, first of all, underlines like how unskilled I am at presenting. So I can kind of aspire to get to that level. But it also shows that at a conference, you can deliver something that is both like intellectually rich, but also entertaining and interesting from start to finish. So thanks, everybody. And we'll see you at day 5. Day 4 of the World Congress of Environmental History was a big day. Today started with an open morning. Some of us signed up to do a field trip to visit downtown Florianopolis to learn a little bit about the history of the city. I joined that group, and we got to walk through some of the city and visit the public market and learn about some of the growth of the city. It was interesting to find out that much of the shoreline of Florianopolis is created with fill pumped from the bottom of the sea to extend the size of the island, which has largely been used for the development of a highway that encircles downtown. It is very similar to the geography of Toronto in that sense. In the afternoon, I went to a session on Histories of Antarctica. It was called Antarctica, Historical Perspectives from the Southern Hemisphere. There were 3 papers that looked at different examples of scientific research that was conducted by different countries in Antarctica, and the ways in which that research was tied up in colonialism, nationalism, and territorial expansion of some of the southern nation states like New Zealand and Australia and Argentina, in terms of the various claims that they've made to parts of Antarctica. The day wrapped up with a plenary talk by Robert Bilott, who is the lawyer who was involved in the fight against DuPont over PFAS, an artificial chemical developed by 3M and used by DuPont in the production of a number of commodities, but most significantly in Teflon. He became involved in a multi-year lawsuit against DuPont regarding the toxicity of this chemical, as it's now made its way into the environments, the water systems, and eventually the bloodstream of millions of Americans and likely millions of other people around the world. It was a jaw-dropping presentation that really tied together modern environmental history with contemporary environmental law and environmental science. Day 5 of the World Congress was a half day, 2 sessions in the morning. I saw an excellent session on international knowledge flow among hydraulic engineers called Border Flows, Hydraulic Engineers and Uncertainty Crossing Boundaries. There were 3 case studies presented in this session, one from Australia, one that dealt with the Dutch Empire, and one that dealt with Canada, all of which focused on different aspects in which engineering knowledge crosses borders and travels the world, and the influence that that mobile knowledge had on reshaping waterscapes around the world. The two examples were irrigation and hydroelectric development. For me, this was a highly relevant panel, not because I do research in water history, but because some of the work that I do deals with engineering. And there are still broader questions about the development of engineering knowledge and how it moves around the world, the relationship between engineering knowledge and private corporations, engineering knowledge and the state, and engineering knowledge and the academy. So there was a lot, I think, in this session for me to think about engineering more broadly. I wrapped up the Congress this year with seeing a session on teaching, and this was about teaching global environmental history. There was a really good discussion about different ways of approaching the design of a global environmental history course, with examples from colleagues who teach at universities in Grenada, the United States, and Canada and New Zealand. And we had a great discussion around a kind of question that one of the panelists posed, which is, why do we teach global environmental history? And the people in the audience gave a whole bunch of different answers, and I think it was a kind of call for reflection about environmental history teaching more broadly, what it is we hope to impart to students, and what we think that students should take away from environmental history. So it was a nice way of rounding out the conference on this final and fifth day of the World Congress of Environmental History. The conference is over, the panels are finished, the field trips have ended, and we've wrapped up the World Congress of Environmental History here on this island in southern Brazil in the state of Santa Catarina. I wanted to end things on this episode with some overall reflections on what I thought of the conference and what some of my takeaways are. And I've really just got one to think about, and it was something that just kept popping up in my head as I was sitting in the sessions, and that was about linkages between different places around the world in global environmental history. The theme of this conference was the Great Acceleration in the North and the South, which is everywhere. This period from the second half of the 20th century to the near present, when humanity's impacts on the Earth's ecosystems became more intensified. And I like this idea and this concept, and we saw lots of examples in the sessions at the conference. What was missing, I think, were the linkages. What tied together the activities of Brazilian governments in dam construction in the mid-20th century to the activities of other governments in Canada or the United States or Egypt or the Soviet Union that were doing some of the same things that the Brazilian government was doing? What do those linkages tell us about the Great Acceleration and the phenomenon of the emergence of the Anthropocene in the 20th century? In a lot of cases, we were left to make the linkages ourselves as participants or observers of the conference. But what I had really hoped for was to see some of the participants in the sessions make some of those connections stronger. And that's something I hope that we see at the next World Congress 5 years from now. Because I think the strength of this conference is its ability to bring together people from many different parts of the world who study many different parts of the world to think about environmental history all together. And it's an opportunity in this field for us to think about more than just our regional or national areas, but to start to ask broader questions about humanity and nature across borders, and to think about the broader Earth biosphere and the effects that humanity has had on the Earth's biosphere. So there were small steps towards that, I think, at this conference, and I hope that when we come back together 5 years from now, we've got a little bit further in terms of making linkages between these case studies from around the world. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. This was a lot of fun to record, a little bit challenging, and I know the audio quality isn't as good as other episodes that we've done here for Nature's Past. But thanks for joining me here in Brazil, and stay tuned to Nature's Past for another episode coming in the near future. Mm-hmm.